Stories from Caravan of Dreams by Idries, Shah.
The Magic Horse. Once upon a time, not so very long ago, there was a realm in which the people were exceedingly prosperous. All kinds of discoveries had been made by them in the growing of plants, in harvesting, in preserving fruits, and in making objects for sale to other countries, and in very many other practical arts. Their king was unusually enlightened, and he encouraged new discoveries and activities, because he knew of their advantage for his people. He had a son named Shah, who liked and was expert in using strange contrivances, and another son called Tambal, a dreamer who seemed interested only in things which were of little value in the eyes of the citizens. From time to time the king, who was named King Mumkin, circulated announcements like this one: "Let all those who have made notable devices and useful artifacts bring them to the palace for examination, so that they may be appropriately rewarded." Now there were two men of that country, an ironsmith and a woodworker, and they were great rivals in most things, and each delighted in making strange and outlandish contraptions. When they heard this announcement one day, they agreed to compete for an award so that their relative merits could be decided once and for all by their king and then publicly recognized. Accordingly, the smith worked day and night on a mighty engine, employing a multitude of talented specialists and surrounding his workshop with high walls so that nobody could see in and his devices and methods shouldn't become known. At the same time, the woodworker took his simple tools and went into a forest, where after long and solitary reflection he prepared his own masterpiece. News of the rivalry spread, and people thought that the smith must easily win, for his cunning works had been seen before, and while the woodworker's products were generally admired, they were only of occasional and undramatic use. When both were ready, the king received them in open court. The smith produced an immense metallic fish which could, he said, swim in and under the water. It could carry large quantities of freight over the land. It could burrow into the earth, and it could even fly slowly through the air. At first, the court found it hard to believe that there could be such a wonder made by man. But when the smith and his assistants demonstrated it, the king was overjoyed and declared the smith among the most honoured in the land, with a special rank and the title of benefactor of the community. Prince Shah was placed in charge of the making of the wondrous fishes, and the services of this new device became available to everybody. Everyone blessed the smith and Shah, as well as the benign and wise monarch whom they loved so much. In the excitement, the self-effacing carpenter had been all but forgotten. Then one day someone said, "But what about the contest? Where is the entry of the woodworker? We all know him to be an ingenious man. Perhaps he has produced something useful too." "How could anything possibly be as useful as the wondrous fishes?" asked Shah. And many of the courtiers and the people agreed with him. But one day the king was bored. He had become accustomed to the novelty of the fishes and the reports of the wonders which they so regularly performed. He said, "Call the woodcarver, for I would now like to see what he has made." The simple woodcarver came into the throne room, carrying a parcel wrapped in coarse cloth. As the whole court craned forward to see what he had, he took off the covering to reveal a wooden horse. It was well enough carved, and it had some intricate patterning chiselled into it, as well as being decorated with coloured paints. But it was only a mere plaything, snapped the king. But father, said Prince Tambal, let us ask the man what it is for. Very well, said the king. What is it for? Your Majesty, stammered the woodcarver, it's a magic horse. It does not look impressive, but it has, as it were, its own inner senses. Unlike the fish, which has to be directed, this horse can interpret the desires of the rider and carry him wherever he needs to go. Such a stupidity is fit only for Tambal, murmured the chief minister at the king's elbow. It cannot have any real advantage when measured against the wondrous fish. The woodcarver was preparing sadly to depart when Tambal said, Father, let me have the wooden horse. All right, said the king, give it to him. Take the woodcarver away and tie him on a tree somewhere so that he will realize that our time is valuable. Let him contemplate the prosperity which the wondrous fish has brought us, and perhaps after some time we shall let him go free to practice whatever he may have learned of real industriousness through true reflection. The woodcarver was taken away, and Prince Tambal left the court carrying the magic horse. Tambal took the horse to his quarters, where he discovered that it had several knobs, cunningly concealed in the carved designs. When these were turned in a certain manner, the horse, together with anyone mounted on it, rose into the air and sped to whatever place was in the mind of the person who moved the knobs. In this way, day after day, Tambal flew to places which he had never visited before. By this process he came to know a great many things. Not surprisingly, he took the horse everywhere with him. One day he met Shah, who said to him, Carrying a wooden horse is a fit occupation for such as you. As for me, I am working for the good of all towards my heart's desire. Tambal thought, I wish I knew what was the good of all, and I wish I could know what my heart's desire really is. When he was next in his room, he sat upon the horse and thought, I would like to find my heart's desire. At the same time, he moved some knobs on the horse's neck. Swifter than light, the horse rose into the air and carried the prince 1,000 days' ordinary journey away to a far kingdom ruled by a magician king. The king, whose name was Kahana, had a beautiful daughter called Precious Pearl, Duri Karima. In order to protect her, he had imprisoned her in a circling palace which wheeled in the sky higher than any mortal could reach. As he was approaching the magic land, Tambal saw the glittering palace in the heavens and alighted there. The princess and the young horseman saw each other and fell in love. My father will never allow us to marry, she said, for he has ordained that I become the wife of the son of another magician king who lives across the cold desert to the east of our homeland. He has vowed that when I am old enough, I shall cement the unity of the two kingdoms by this marriage. His will has never been successfully opposed. I will go and try to reason with him, answered Tambal as he mounted the magic horse again. But when he descended into the magic land, there were so many new and exciting things to see that he didn't hurry to the palace, and when at length he did approach it, the drum at the gate, indicating the absence of the king, was already beating. "He has gone to visit his daughter in the whirling palace," said a passer-by when Tambal asked him when the king might be back. "And he usually spends several hours at a time with her." Tambal went to a quiet place where he wheeled the horse to carry him to the king's own apartment. "I'll approach him at his own home," he thought to himself, "for if I go to the whirling palace without his permission, he may be angry." He hid behind some curtains in the palace when he got there, and lay down to sleep. Meanwhile, unable to keep her secret, the Princess Precious Pearl had confessed to her father that she had been visited by a man on a flying horse, and that he wanted to marry her. Kahana was furious. He placed sentries around the whirling palace and returned to his own apartment to think things over. As soon as he entered his bedchamber, one of the tongueless magic servants guarding it pointed to the wooden horse lying in a corner. "Aha!" exclaimed the magician king. "Now I have him. Let us look at this horse and see what manner of thing it may be." As he and his servants were examining the horse, the prince managed to slip away and conceal himself in another part of the palace. After twisting the knobs and tapping the horse and generally trying to understand how it worked, the king was baffled. "Take that thing away. It has no virtue now, even if it ever had any," he said. "It's just a trifle fit for children." The horse was put in a store cupboard. Now, King Kahana thought that he should make arrangements for his daughter's wedding without delay, in case the fugitive might have other powers or devices with which to try to win her. So he called her to his own palace and sent a message to the other magician king, asking that the prince who was to marry her be sent to claim his bride. Meanwhile, Prince Tambal, escaping from the palace by night when some guards were asleep, decided that he must try to return to his own country. His quest for his heart's desire now seemed almost hopeless. "If it takes me the rest of my life," he said to himself, "I shall come back here, bringing troops to take this kingdom by force if necessary. I can only do that by convincing my father that I must have his help to attain my heart's desire." So saying, he set off. But never was a man worse equipped for such a journey. An alien travelling on foot, without any kind of provisions, facing pitiless heat and freezing nights and sandstorms as well, he soon became hopelessly lost in the desert. Now, in his delirium, he started to blame himself, his father, the magician king, the woodcarver, even the princess and the magic horse itself. Sometimes he thought he saw water ahead of him, sometimes fair cities, sometimes he felt elated, sometimes incomparably sad. Sometimes he even thought that he had companions in his difficulties, but when he shook himself, he saw that he was quite alone. He seemed to have been travelling for an eternity. Suddenly, when he had given up and started again several times, he saw something directly in front of him. It looked like a mirage, a garden full of delicious fruits, sparkling and almost, as it were, beckoning him towards them. Tambal did not at first take much notice of this, but soon as he walked he saw that he was indeed passing through such a garden. He gathered some of the fruits and tasted them cautiously. They were delicious. They took away his fear as well as his hunger and thirst. When he was full, he lay down in the shade of a huge and welcoming tree and fell asleep. When he woke up, he felt well enough, but something seemed to be wrong. Running to a nearby pool, he looked at his reflection in the water, and staring up at him was a horrible apparition. It had a long beard, curved horns, and ears a foot long. He looked down at his hands, and they were covered with fur. Was it a nightmare? He tried to wake himself, but all the pinching and pummelling had no effect. Now, almost bereft of his senses, beside himself with fear and horror, thrown into transports of screaming, racked with sobs, he threw himself on the ground. Whether I live or die, he thought, these accursed fruits have finally ruined me. Even with the greatest army of all time, conquest will not help me now. Nobody would marry me now, much less the Princess Precious Pearl. I cannot even imagine the beast who would not be terrified at the sight of me, let alone my heart's desire. And he lost consciousness. When he woke again, it was dark, and a light was approaching through the groves of silent trees. Fear and hope struggled in him. As it came closer, he saw that the light was from a lamp enclosed in a brilliant star-like shape, and it was carried by a bearded man who walked in the pool of brightness which it cast around. The man saw him. "My son," he said, "you have been affected by the influences of this place. If I had not come past, you would have remained just another beast of this enchanted grove, for there are many more like you. But I can help you." Tambal wondered whether this man was a devil in disguise, perhaps the very owner of the enchanted evil trees. But as his sense came back, he realized he had nothing to lose. "Help me, father," he said to the sage. "Help me." "If you really want your heart's desire," said the other man, "you have only to fix this desire firmly in your mind, not thinking of the fruit. You then have to take up some of the dried fruits, not the fresh, delicious ones. Take up the dried fruits lying at the foot of all these trees and eat them. Then follow your destiny." So saying, he walked away. While the sage's light disappeared into the darkness, Tambal saw that the moon was rising, and in its rays he could see that there were indeed piles of dried fruits under every tree. He gathered some and ate them as quickly as he could. Slowly, as he watched, the fur disappeared from his hands and arms. The horns first shrank, then vanished. The beard fell away. He was himself again. By now it was first light, and in the dawn he heard the tinkling of camel bells. A procession was coming through the enchanted forest. It was undoubtedly the cavalcade of some important personage on a long journey, for as Tambal stood there, 2 outriders detached themselves from the glittering escort and galloped up to him. "In the name of the Prince our Lord, we demand some of your fruit. His Celestial Highness is thirsty, and has indicated a desire for some of these strange apricots," said an officer. Still Tambal did not move. Such was his numbed condition after his recent experiences. He stood there dazed, as the prince himself came down from the palanquin and said, "I am Jadugazada, son of the magician king of the East. Here is a bag of gold, oaf. I am having some of your fruit because I am desirous of it. I am in a hurry to claim my bride, Princess Precious Pearl, daughter of Kahana, magician king of the West." At these words, Tambal's heart turned over. But realizing that this must be his destiny, which the sage had told him to follow, he offered the prince as much of the fruit as he could eat. And when he had eaten, the prince began to fall asleep. As he did so, horns, fur, and huge ears started to grow out of him. The soldiers shook him, and the prince began to behave in a very strange way. He claimed that he was normal and that they were deformed. The councillors who accompanied the party restrained the prince and then held a hurried debate. Tambal claimed that all would have been well if the prince hadn't fallen asleep. Eventually, they decided that the only thing to do was to put Tambal in the palanquin to play the part of the prince. The horned Jadu-Gazada was tied to a horse with a veil thrown over his face, disguised as a serving woman. "He may recover his wits eventually," said the councillors, "and in any case he is still our prince. Tambal shall marry the girl. Then, as soon as possible, we shall carry them all back to our own country for our king to unravel the problem." Tambal, biding his time and following his destiny, agreed to his own part in the masquerade. When the party arrived at the capital of the Kingdom of the West, the king himself came out to meet them. Tambal was taken to the princess as her bridegroom, and she was so astonished that she nearly fainted. But Tambal managed to whisper to her very quickly what had happened, and they were duly married, amid great jubilation. In the meantime, the horned prince had half recovered his wits, but not his human form, and his escort still kept him under cover. As soon as the feasting was over, the chief of the horned prince's party, who had been keeping Tambal and the princess under a very close watch, presented himself to the court. He said, "O just and glorious monarch, fountain of wisdom, the time has now come, according to the pronouncements of our astrologers and soothsayers, to conduct the bridal pair back to our own land, so that they may be established in their new home under the most felicitous circumstances and influences." The princess turned to Tambal in alarm, for she knew that Jadu-Gazada would claim her as soon as they were on the open road, and make an end to Tambal into the bargain. Tambal whispered to her, "Fear nothing. We must act as best we can, following our destiny. Agree to go, making only the condition that you will not travel without the wooden horse." At first, the magician king was annoyed at this foible of his daughter's. He realized that she wanted the horse because it was connected somehow with her first suitor. But the chief minister of the horned prince said, "Majesty, I cannot see that this is anything worse than a whim for a toy, such as any young girl might have. I hope that you will allow her to have her plaything, so that we may hasten homeward." And so the magician king agreed, and soon the cavalcade was resplendently on its way. After the king's escort had withdrawn, and before the time of the first night halt, the hideous Jadu-Gazada threw off his veil and cried out to Tambal, "Miserable author of my misfortunes, I now intend to bind you hand and foot to take you captive back to my own land. If, when we arrive there, you do not tell me how to remove this enchantment, I will have you flayed alive, inch by inch. Now, give me the princess' precious pearl." Tambal ran to the princess, and in front of the astonished party rose into the sky on the wooden horse, with Precious Pearl mounted behind him. Within just a matter of minutes, the couple alighted at the palace of King Mumkin. They related everything that had happened to them, and the king was almost overcome with delight at their safe return. He at once gave orders for the hapless woodcarver to be released, recompensed, and applauded by the entire populace. When the king was gathered to his fathers, Princess Precious Pearl and Prince Tambal succeeded him. Prince Hoshiar was quite pleased too, because he was still entranced by the wondrous fish. "I am glad for your own sakes if you are happy," he used to say to them. "But for my own part, nothing is more rewarding than concerning myself with the wondrous fish." And this history is the origin of a strange saying current among the people of that land, yet whose beginnings have now been forgotten. The saying is, those who want fish can achieve much through fish, and those who do not know their heart's desire may first have to hear the story of the wooden horse.
The Tale of Melon City. One day, the king of a certain city decided that he would like a triumphal arch built, so that he could ride under it with all pomp for the desirable edification of the multitude. But when the great moment came, his crown was knocked off. The arch had been built too low. The ruler therefore commanded, in his rightful wrath, that the chief of the builders should be hanged. Gallows were prepared, but as he was being taken to the place of execution, the master builder shouted that it was all the fault of the workmen who had done the actual construction job. The king, with his customary sense of justice, called the workers to account. But they escaped the charge by explaining that the masons had made the bricks of the wrong size. And the masons said that they had only carried out the orders of the architect. He, in turn, reminded the king that his majesty had, at the last moment, made some amendments of his own to the plans, changing them. "Summon the wisest man of the country," said the ruler, "for this is undoubtedly a difficult problem, and we need counsel." The wisest man was carried in, unable to stand on his own feet, so ancient and therefore so wise was he. "It is evident," he quavered, "that in law the actual culprit must be punished, and that is, in this case, quite evidently, none other than the arch itself." Applauding his decision, the king ordered that the offending arch be carried to the scaffold. But as it was being taken there, one of the royal counselors pointed out that this arch was something which had actually touched the august head of the monarch, and must surely never be disgraced by the rope of execution. As in the meantime, exhausted by his exertions, the venerable wise man had breathed his last, the people were unable to apply to him for an interpretation of this new observation. The doctors of law, however, decreed that the lower part of the arch, which had not touched anything at all, could be hanged for the crime of the whole arch. But when the executioner tried to put the arch into the noose, he found that the rope was too short. The rope-maker was called, but he soon explained that in his opinion it was the scaffold that was too high. He suggested that the carpenters were at fault. "The crowd is getting impatient," said the king, "and we must therefore quickly find someone to hang. We can postpone the considerations of finer points like guilt into a later, more convenient occasion." In a surprisingly short time, all the people in the city had been carefully measured, but only one was found to be tall enough to fit the gallows. It was the king himself. Such was the popular enthusiasm at the discovery of a man who would fit that the king had to conform, and he was hanged. "Thank goodness we found someone," said the prime minister, "for if we had not satisfied the appetite of the mob, they would have undoubtedly turned against the crown." But there were important matters to consider, for almost at once it was realized that the king was dead. "In conformity with custom," announced the heralds in the streets, "the first man who passes the city gate shall decide who is to be our next great ruler." The very next man to wander past the gate was an idiot. He was quite unlike the ordinary sensible citizens with whom we have become familiar, and when he was asked who should be king, immediately said, Melon." This was because he always said, Melon, to every question. In fact, he thought about nothing else, being very fond of melons. And thus it was that a melon, with due ceremony, was crowned. Now that was years and years ago. Nowadays, when people ask the inhabitants of that land why their king seems to be a melon, they say because of the customary choice. His Majesty obviously desires to be a Melon. Certainly we shall allow him to remain one until his further pleasure be known. He has, in our country, every right to be what he wants to be. We are content with that, so long as he doesn't bother us.
The Prince of Darkness. Once upon a time, in the city of Damascus, there lived a goldsmith. He made such exquisite jewellery that his fame spread far and wide, even to the lower regions, where it reached the ears of Iblis, the evil one. One day, when the goldsmith was sitting in his shop, finishing the wings of a golden butterfly, he looked up and saw none other than the dark-eyed evil one looking through the window. "Allah have mercy upon me!" cried the goldsmith. "Has my last hour come?" The door opened as if pushed by invisible hands, and the tall, black-robed figure entered. The goldsmith froze, but the evil one just smiled and said, "Good fellow, have no fear. I have not come for you. I was merely looking at your wonderful handiwork. I have heard, even in the lower regions, of your exquisite craftsmanship. I'd like to have some samples. Shall we say the few pieces which you have in the window?" "Why, yes, certainly. Have all you please," said the goldsmith willingly. He was so glad that the evil one was going to spare him that he would have given anything. "I will wrap them up, and you shall take them at once. There is a jewelled bear, a golden fish with ruby eyes, and a necklace fit for a—" "No, no," said the evil one impatiently. "I do not want them now. I will come back for them another time. Keep all that there is in the window for me, all that there is, even though I may be years in returning. Will you promise?" "I promise," said the goldsmith, and the evil one vanished. "Who is that talking to you?" asked the goldsmith's wife, bringing her husband a glass of sherbet. "My dear," said he, "I feel quite faint. It was none other than Iblis, the accursed Prince of Darkness himself. He made me promise to keep everything which I have in the window for him, said he'd come back to collect it when he's ready. Though I grieve for my beautiful pieces of handiwork, I'm only grateful that, thanks to the mercy of Allah, he has not carried me off to hell." "Everything in the window?" said his wife. "Yes, that's what the evil one said," said the goldsmith. "Isn't that a piece of luck?" But to his surprise, the woman clapped her hands to her head and began to cry. "Alas, alas, our child is playing in the window, and that means that the evil one means to take her too when he comes back," she said. The goldsmith rushed to have a look, and sure enough, there was his little daughter, innocently playing with the golden jewels which her father had put on show. His face changed. "Quick, wife," said he, "go to the silversmith's and bring me an ounce of virgin silver." His wife did as she was bid, and, still crying into her handkerchief, brought back the silver. The goldsmith went to his workshop, and taking the Holy Koran from the shelf, read the throne verse from it. Then he hammered out the silver as thin as paper, and engraved a talisman for his daughter to wear around her neck. For he knew that a charm was most potent if worked in silver, and he told his daughter that she must never take off the talisman, or Iblis could carry her away. But the years passed, and still the evil one did not come back. The goldsmith and his wife had almost forgotten about the whole affair, when suddenly one day he appeared again in the goldsmith's shop. "I have come for my treasures as you promised," said the evil one. "And the girl, she must be about 17 now, is she not?" "Yes," said the goldsmith. "But change your mind, O mighty Iblis, about our daughter. She is the only child of our old age. I beg you, please, please spare her. Take me instead. I am beyond the pleasures of life, but she is young. Take me, great Prince of Darkness." "No, no, no, I cannot possibly do that," said the evil one, dashing aside the beautiful golden figures which the goldsmith handed him. "I want her especially." So the goldsmith sent the servant to ask his daughter to come, as she was required urgently. Now the girl, whose name was Zora, was taking a bath, and in her haste to do her father's bidding, she forgot to put on the talismanic necklace when she dressed. She ran to the shop, but there was something about the tall, dark stranger with her father which made her shrink away from him. "Zora, my child," said the goldsmith, "this is Idries, the mighty ruler of the lower regions, who has come to take you away with him." Thinking that his daughter was protected by the silver talisman, he continued, "But as you have your talisman round your neck, you need not go, so have no fear." "What?" the evil one cried. "How dare you try to trick me? I will not be robbed like this." And he reached out his hand to grasp the girl's clothing, but she ran away so quickly that only her veil was left in his claw-like fingers. Zora ran as fast as her feet would carry her and found her talisman beside the bath. She put it on and was protected from the evil one immediately. Idries gave a cry of rage and said to the goldsmith, "All right, I'm going now, but I'll be back for your daughter in 7 days, mark my words." And he vanished to make certain arrangements with his devils. Now the goldsmith had to think fast, and finally he thought of a plan, and it was this: that he should make a waxen model of his daughter and conceal a machine inside the body so that it could walk and talk like a human being. He worked secretly in the cellar for 7 days and 7 nights, until he had made a perfect replica of his daughter, so perfect that even her mother could hardly tell the difference. Then, having sent the girl away to her aunt's house in a nearby village, the goldsmith awaited his diabolical visitor. Sure enough, as he was sitting in his workshop, the evil one appeared once more and said, "Bring your daughter hither this instant, old man, without her talisman, or I will set my devils to burn your house down. I am in no mood to be trifled with at the moment." The goldsmith put his head behind the curtains which led to the women's apartments and said, "Zora, my child, come out at once, for the mighty Idries, Prince of Darkness, has come for you." When she heard her husband's words, the goldsmith's wife turned the key in the back of the beautiful life-size doll and arranged a rose-pink veil around its head. "I hear and obey, father," she said in a gentle voice, and parted the curtains, giving the doll a push. Then she hid herself again and waited. The goldsmith held his breath as he saw the lovely creature glide into the room. And when Idries, the evil one, glimpsed the shrouded figure, he smiled and called, "Come to me now, beautiful mortal, so that I may take you with me to my wonderful kingdom of darkness. There you shall be my queen of eternal night." He pulled off the pink veil and saw a pair of modestly lowered lashes. The voice of the doll murmured softly, "I hear and obey, Prince of Darkness." So the evil one snatched the image up in his arms and bore it away to the lower regions. Now that night there was a great feast in the kingdom of everlasting fire, for Idries had previously instructed his minions to prepare everything of the finest for the night's entertainment. The food was wonderful, the wine was perfect, the music was gay, but unfortunately the fire was just a little too hot. While the evil one was sitting and drinking merrily on his ebony throne, the wax maiden started to melt and fell into the flames. The model was devoured in an instant. The devils stood aghast and leant on their pitchforks, wondering how their devilish master was going to take his loss. There was a second's silence. Then Idries cried out, "Well, these humans are a fragile lot. That girl had only been with us for a short while. What chance had she of lasting down here as my bride for eternity? I was mistaken. You, build up the fire. Bring more wine." And the party became merrier, and the wine flowed, and the great fire crackled louder than ever before. The feast went on far into the night, and the evil one never thought of Zora, the goldsmith's daughter, again.
Hospitality. The people of Turkestan are famous for their generosity, their self-respect, and their love of horses. A certain Turkestani called Anwar Beg once owned a beautiful, fast, and highly pedigreed horse. Everyone wanted to buy it, but he refused to sell, no matter the price offered. Time and again, a friend of his, a horse dealer named Yaqub, visited Anwar, hoping to buy the horse, but Anwar always refused to sell it. One day news got around that Anwar had fallen upon hard times, so Yaqub said to himself, "Now is the time to visit Anwar. He will have to sell the horse because he needs the money." He went straight to his friend's house. Of course, Anwar welcomed Yaqub, and before any business could be discussed, they had to go through the traditional forms of hospitality. A meal was served, which they ate with relish. When, at last, Yaqub was able to discuss the subject of his visit, Anwar said, "It is now impossible for us to talk about the horse. Hospitality comes first, and since you visited me, I had to entertain you even though I was poor. The fact is, we had to kill the horse to provide a meal, as this was the best possible way to fulfill the duties of a host."
The Pulse of the Princess. Sultan Sanjar had returned from the shrine of the Master Bahauddin in Bukhara, and ever since that he had been sad. Some people connected the two as cause and effect, but others held that the sorrow of the king was due to the mysterious illness of his daughter. Princess Banu was wilting. Day by day, her strange ailment seemed to get a stronger grip upon her. All the physicians who had been called in to advise were baffled. Then, one day, a stranger arrived at the capital city of their country. He wore a green robe and walked bent and called himself Shadrach, the physician. He offered to cure the princess. The king allowed him to see her, but threatened him that if he did not heal his daughter, he would be beheaded. Surrounded by an interested audience, the physician approached the couch where the princess lay, wan and weary. Instead of making any examination, instead of trying any remedy, as was expected of him, the green-robed man began to tell the princess tales. They were stories of far distant lands, of wars and heroes, of peace and of glory. And as he did so, his fingers stayed on her pulse. At length his diagnosis was finished. The princess withdrew, and Shadrach addressed the king. "Your Majesty, I have determined by the reactions of her pulse that she is in love, and that she is in love with someone who lives in Bukhara, that person lives in the street of the jewelers, and that of all the men who live in the street of the jewelers in Bukhara, it is none other than Abdul Fazl, a young and handsome man whom I have described to her, and at the mention of whose name she fainted. I happen to know everyone in Bukhara, as well as in many other places, and by this art I have arrived at the cause of her disease." Now the king wondered at the skill of this physician. He was also relieved that the cause of her illness had been discovered, and he was furiously angry because the lady was in love with such an ignoble wretch, for such Abdul Fazl was known to be. The jeweller, however, was sent for. As soon as he arrived, the princess began to recover. Within a few days, she was well again. The jeweller was lording it over almost everyone, and the physician, Shadrach, as a reward, had been made Grand Vizier. The king and the doctor realized that this insufferable youth was not for the princess. They also knew that they could not send him away or otherwise dispose of him, because that would certainly cause the princess's malaise to return. Shadrach provided the answer. He caused to be administered to Abdul Fazl a medicine which prematurely aged him, making him become older each day as if he had aged by 20 years. In no time at all, the princess was beginning to be repulsed by his bent back and his grey locks. At the same time, Shadrach administered to himself another medicine, and by its effect, at the same pace at which the jeweler was aging, Shadrach became younger and younger. Before very long, the princess fell in love with the young physician. When Abdul Fazl was driven from the court, the Princess Banu hardly noticed. She and the physician and the sultan lived happily ever after. Thus do things sometimes develop in a manner contrary to their first probability, according to what influences are brought to bear.
Letter from a Queen. Mahmud of Ghazni was a great Afghan conqueror of the 10th century, whose very name struck terror into the hearts of the Persians and the Indians. When the ruler of Persian Iraq died, his wife took over the province as regent. Accordingly, Mahmud wrote to her demanding tribute under the threat of invasion. This is the letter which the Queen Mother sent back to Ghazni. While my husband was alive, I was in fear of the great King Mahmud, who has overrun Persia and India. Now I have no fear. I know that such a monarch would never send an army to combat a woman. If he were to fight me, I would resist to the end. If I were to win, I would be renowned for evermore. But if the Sultan Mahmud were to prevail, men would merely say that he had defeated an old woman. Because I realize that the Sultan is too wise a man to lay himself open to either of these alternatives, I am not afraid of what may happen. When Sultan Mahmud the Idol-breaker read this message, he was so impressed that he swore never to invade Iraq while the Queen lived.
The Artillery. Syed Jan Fashan Khan, the great Afghan warlord, was invited to India, and a huge military display was put on for him. It was intended to illustrate to this independent Afghan chief that the warlike capacities of the British Empire were such that it would be to his advantage to respect it. An artillery officer was assigned to the Khan, and he shouted enthusiastically, drawing the chief's attention every time that a shell hit its target. Later, this man and several others were invited back to Pagman to be the guests of Jan Fashan Khan. As they were sitting at the banquet, a man came up to the Khan and said something. As soon as he had answered him, Jan Fashan turned to the British officers and said, in great excitement, "Did you hear that?" "What did he say?" they asked. "It's not what he said," replied the Khan, "but the fact that I understood him and he understood me." The British officers were baffled. The following day, Jan Fashan Khan took his guests on a tour of his stables. He pointed to some horses. One of them was being fed. "Just look how he eats!" roared the Khan. Another horse was being exercised. "He can actually walk and run," shouted the Khan, clapping his hands with delight. The visitors thought that their host must be mad. They were quite unable to understand his extraordinary behavior until he said, as they were leaving, "You see, gentlemen, if you have guns which do exactly what they were designed to do, hit the target, I, too, am surrounded by things which also appear to be fulfilling their function quite adequately. What I have learned from you is to get excited about it."
The Two Brothers. There were once two brothers who together farmed a piece of land and always shared its produce. One night one of them woke up and thought, "My brother is married and has children. Because of this, he has anxieties and expenses which are not mine. So I will go and move some sacks from my share into his storeroom, because it's only fair. I shall do this under cover of night, so that he may not, from his generosity, dispute with me about it." He moved the sacks and went back to bed. Not long after, the other brother woke up and thought to himself, "It's not fair that I should have half of all the corn in our field. My brother, who is unmarried, lacks my pleasures in having a family. I think I'll try to compensate a little by moving some of my corn into his storeroom." So saying, he crept out and did so. The next morning, each was amazed that he still had the same number of sacks in his storeroom. And afterwards, neither could understand why, year after year, the number of sacks in the storerooms remained the same, even when each of them shifted some by stealth.